Now, we are doing this podcast slightly with International Women's Day in our minds, but I don't want to make it an International Women's Day thing because I think that all becomes slightly affected and possibly even a little bit annoying. I want to use this daily tea to discuss men, women, girls, boys, and analyse the state of things in 2025 because I've got two observations to make. One, that boys and men seem to be falling behind. But two, even though they've kind of won some of the gender wars, I'm not sure women are that much happier.
The debate has changed so much about what equality looks like. As much as speaking about women, we should be speaking about class and where people are from. And if we don't, the resentment that many young men and older men are starting to show will only grow.
Welcome to the Daily Tea with me, Camilla.
And me, Kamal Ahmed.
So both of us have written quite a lot in the last week, haven't we, about men and women. And for me, it started with this report by the Centre for Social Justice. That's a think tank that was set up by former Tory leader Ian Duncan Smith, called The Lost Boys. And it's 74 pages basically dedicated to how much boys and men have fallen behind women. It's making the suggestion that actually equality has gone too far. And now it seems as if females are doing better than their male counterparts. That's evidenced by the fact that girls are now ahead of boys in school and higher education. In the 18 to 24-year-old age bracket, they're out-earning men. Men are far more likely to be NEETs, not in education and employment. And it also speaks to this idea of disharmony between the sexes. So I followed up that report with a subsequent article saying that a survey had found that 2/3 of women in that 18 to 24 age bracket feared men, that they found men pretty frightening. And in this, I want to discuss the reasons for that. Is it toxic masculinity? Is it a kind of Andrew Tate fueled turning of the die onto women? Is it about fatherlessness? What's it about? And I think we want to speak about it not just as a professional man and a woman, but also as parents. You've got a girl and a boy. I've got two girls and a boy. And I think it's relevant. And I think people want to hear some reasoned debate about where we are in the battle of the sexes.
There's nothing more boring than a bloke saying, feminism is gone too far. I really dislike that. I don't want to sit here in a T-shirt saying this is what a feminist looks like, because that's equally irritating. But you're absolutely right. If you look at the data, the CSJ report on Lost Boys is very, very interesting on the 2 points you make. But I wrote about some other data, which I also received in a similar area. This was Ipsos polling data, which showed that when asked the question, have rights for women, open quotes, gone too far, close quotes, the UK was one of the fastest rising countries in the 24 countries that Ipsos asked that question in, where people, men in particular, thought that statement was true.
Wow.
And that has been a trend that has been visible since 2018. And as you say, we've both written about this in the Telegraph over the past week. But when I started my piece, I really wanted to make sure that I wasn't landing this idea that somehow we need to reverse the progress or somehow women have now got everything they need, by remembering things like every year the police receive reports that 1 million women suffer physical abuse at the hands of men every year, that mothers earn on average 24% less than fathers. We still have the echoes of the fact that I was amazed when I saw this, that it's less than 100 years ago that women were given the equal right to vote as men had.
Yes.
And so I think this whole debate needs to be put in context of a situation where, certainly in my lifetime, I first came into the working world in the 1990s, when pay gaps were super pro-men. If I think of my grandmother's generation, she was a generation where she wasn't allowed to apply for a mortgage. And people were refused, women were refused bank accounts. Well, that's astonishing and not that long ago. So I'm
Yeah.
just very concerned that we need to ensure that, yes, we focus on the right things, because there is resentment growing over this narrative that women's rights have gone too far. But the history of women at least having a degree of equal opportunity with men is short and can quite quickly be lost by a backlash, because there has been some advantage taken of this idea around money, educational achievement, which has led to a pretty rich seam on social media, particularly for the appalling antics, I call them, of Andrew Tates of this world, who build this idea that men have to fight back and be real men again, and somehow we've lost the idea of what masculinity is. We shouldn't allow that to happen, but we should remember that actually a lot of these things are now to do not with gender, but are to do with class and where you come from. And that's a very different type of discussion that involves young men, it involves young women, and also we have to kind of connect this debate to the whole debate around race as well, and racism, and how does race affect equality, because that's all broken down as well. Because if you look at the data on educational attainment, if you look at the data on earning capacity, many black and brown people do incredibly well in this country now. And so it's a different thing.
Yes.
The debate now is about class and background much more. I hate the word class, actually. It's
But
just
hang on,
about
are you
do you
saying-
have economic, opportunities in front
Yeah.
of you or not?
Are you saying that this is about the kind of working class white boys being lost thing? I mean, I agree with you on that, and that is the focus of the CSJ report largely. It's people living in communities where they don't have good economic outlooks or opportunities that seem to be lagging behind. I suppose there's been a lot of focus, hasn't there, on specific equality issues, or say, for instance, the kind of BLM racism argument, perhaps even the trans argument, that I think has kind of excluded women somewhat. Basic equality must surely depend on, for instance, women and men being paid the same for the same job. And yet still that's not a given, which seems extraordinary, really, doesn't it? On the other hand, when you're talking there about female advancement and this, the other key statistic, of course, is how more likely young men are than women to take their own lives. And we've seen the pernicious effect, I think, of social media in a number of different spheres that have had a huge effect on both men and women. So on the female side, feelings of a lack of self-worth because of comparisons made on Instagram, also echoed by young men looking at buff models showing off their pectoral muscles and all the rest of it. Pernicious content. You talked about Andrew Tate there, the idea that we can have an influencer in any way having an internet following, and then having an internet following among young men, among boys, is horrifying. You've then got the spectre of hardcore pornography in the background of all this, what men are able to access, how easily they're able to access it, and then how that makes them feel about women, or indeed their sexual expectations of women. But the other overriding thing is, we have got more equality in terms of my seniority here wouldn't have happened if I had been born 2 decades earlier. But then I think to myself, and I'll quote our esteemed colleague Alison Pearson on this, is it a case of us having it all, or is it just a case of women doing it all? Because as a working mother, and we have been preached to on this subject by Meghan this week, I just sometimes think I'm running myself ragged, trying to work, trying to be a good mum, balancing that whole good journo, good mum thing, and maybe just running around in circles getting nowhere.
We know that there's still a huge inequality in childcare, and that women still take, the huge majority of childcare is done by women, and economies completely undervalue the value of that, not just socially, but economically to the whole of our economy. If it wasn't for the next generation being brought up well, being put through education, being well parented, we wouldn't have any economic growth at all.
Well,
and that is not seen. What happened in economies over centuries was that was seen as an economically free service. And if you look at what are described rather patronizingly as the caring sector, like nursing, like care homes, like a lot of in catering, a lot of the work where women were encouraged to have employment, those were regularly paid far, far less than what was seen as male employment. You know, the whole argument that there's been between people who worked in local authority kitchens and people who worked collecting the bins. Collecting the bins was a man's job, was paid at a higher rate than women who worked in the kitchens in local authorities, and that has caused all these cases of unequal pay claims. And that's been part of the issue, which we still have not unraveled, although the pay gap has changed enormously, particularly for women who've been through higher levels of education. There are still some really deep structural issues.
Also, there's no admission that many of the men that are in positions of authority are in them because they've got women looking after their children. You know, it never really gets acknowledged. And we were having a debate here today because we had a panel for International Women's Day discussing the idea that historically there have been very few female editors of national newspapers. Well, why would that be? Because it requires you to work a 5 to 9 rather than a 9 to 5. And that actually that's usually the preserve of men because fortunately they've got a wife at home. You know, if I had a wife at home, I probably would have been able to escalate my career quicker than I have done. So that's a problem. And what do you think of Andrew Tate, this former sort of kickboxer from Luton that ends up being hugely outspoken on a number of different cultural issues initially, then basically becomes a self-confessed misogynist, because apparently that's acceptable in the 21st century. And he's back in the news headlines because he and his brother Tristan, who are facing very serious charges of sexual assault and human trafficking out in Romania, they deny those claims, but that's what they're facing, have got on a private jet in the last week or so, gone back to the US. Before I came up here, I just saw him popping up on my X feed because he's been interviewed by Candace Owens as if, you know, nothing much has happened. Okay, I get it. Innocent until proven guilty. But I tell you what this guy is guilty of. He is guilty of absolutely disgusting rhetoric towards women that apparently is lapped up by a whole generation of boys and young men.
I think he's one of those people that has realised, unlike what you might describe as the equalities industry, that the conversation has changed because of social media. The ability to put forward what seemed to be superficially attractive arguments that no one respects men anymore. It was better when men were able to be real men, whatever that may mean. The equalities industry has found it almost impossible to respond to that. I think in terms of what our children think about it, certainly it is initially attractive, as for your son. So he looks at it and he thinks, oh yeah, but actually what you find out is that young men are quite able to think for themselves. And as long as they have the sort of social capital, the tools, the ability to think for themselves, they can quite quickly work their way through it. What Andrew Tate, though, has done is he's linked some things which we could support, i.e. self-sufficiency. He has this whole slightly ludicrous hustlers university idea, which is about how to kind of make money. It is all connected, as you say, with misogyny and sort of outrageous behaviour. But there's a kernel in there, as ever with lots of these arguments. There's always a kernel of something that's sort of right, which is this idea of not standing on your own 2 feet, but the idea of self-sufficiency, as I said.
An aspiration.
But I think, an
probably.
aspiration, and that not many people have been focusing on white working class boys, or I would say the working class period.
Yeah.
Whether you're a girl, whether you're a boy, whether you're white, whether you're black, whether you're brown. And I would say if you're disabled, from whatever class you happen to be from. You know, we often forget that equality is many faceted, and inequality can harm a lot of different people. But I certainly found, speaking to young people, that they can work their way through those things quite quickly. Someone that used to work for me at my company that I started in this social media space called the News Movement, Freddie Feltham, he was asked onto Good Morning Britain to discuss how young men, he's a young man himself, I think he must be about 24, 25, so right in that sweet spot of who Andrew Tate is trying to target. He went on Good Morning Britain to talk about this whole problem with toxic masculinity.
Young men feel a bit priced out of this conversation, and they have done for the past 5 years, I think. I think we shouldn't be shaming young people, anyone, let alone young men. And I think a lot of them do feel a sense of shame around these conversations, around relationships, around the way in which the world accommodates them. We've had a focus, which is, by the way, well placed.
Some people would argue that shame is an effective way of holding a mirror up to behaviour that is unacceptable. And without that, how is progress made?
I think shame and guilt are good insofar as confronting for yourself what problems you have and to take action. But there reaches a certain point where those things aren't helpful.
I think one of the issues there with shaming people, it shuts down really vital dialogue that we need. We need to create safe spaces to talk to young men and boys where they don't stick to a social script. We want to hear the truth, but sometimes it's very difficult to hear.
It's interesting that, just as I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you. As a mother of a son, I feel very much that it's challenging how to raise that son, because they will say things. I like to believe and hope I can be confident that he's not a follower of Andrew Tate. I'm pretty sure he isn't. But comments are made generally on social media, in the playground, on TikTok, which they then repeat and are attacked for, probably quite rightly, nothing on the scale of this. And then you find, well, gosh, they're just trying to feel their way as well. So I sort of know what you mean. But what is the answer? Because we can't, as a society, approve of it, can we?
No, but we've got to have conversations about what positive anything is, right? We're talking about positive masculinity right now. This is a big term. We don't know what it looks like yet, but we should be having a conversation about that. And the conversation starts by asking young men, looking them in the eye and saying, what are you worried about?
I was just thinking then, Kamal, when you're talking particularly about the class issue, that it is astonishing, really. Just take out the racial element of the Pakistani nature of the grooming gangs. This idea that for quite a long period of time, working class girls were treated like white trash and the authorities just turned a blind eye to it. I mean, we can see similar patterns being played out. You know, we've had warnings in this Daily Tea studio about the pernicious nature of criminal grooming and how vulnerable working class white boys, working class black boys, boys growing up on estates. Can we talk about fatherlessness? Are we allowed? I mean, this is the other thing. It's been kind of toxified, hasn't it? This idea of talking about fatherlessness. You might have an opinion on this, having been brought up largely by a single mother. I know your dad was on the scene, of course, so it's slightly different. We don't want to stigmatise. My husband's lost his father when he was 6 years old, so he was effectively brought up by a single mother. You know, I don't like that, but the importance of a male role model, it's been identified in the Lost Boys report, which suggests that 1 in 5 young men in the UK today are growing up without a father. I find that a very, very stark and depressing statistic, I've got to be honest.
And if you look at school as well, particularly primary school, very few male teachers. So, you know, young boys, may not have a figure of authority or someone who could mentor them. They often are surrounded by women. I actually find there could be the opposite effect, which is it's good to be surrounded by powerful women. I hope that that's given me at least some ideas and connections that are more positive. Yes, my mother and my father, divorced when I was very young. As you say, my father was on the scene, but in a way, this is the 1970s and 80s. On the scene was very different in those days. I did see him regularly, which is actually, for that area, pretty progressive. But I think having my strong mother, my grandmother as well, were very powerful figures. My auntie were very powerful figures in my life. And being brought up by women actually, I hope, gave me a different approach to the world around me. So it is important to have male figures, but as you say, not in that cliched way that some people say. Let's look at the Ipsos polling that they've just put out, which I wrote about. One interesting thing in it is that, and this is where the social media issue, I think, does become really pertinent, is that it is younger men who are who most agree with the statement, women's rights have gone too far. And there was a fascinating finding as well that Gen Z are more likely to think that a man who stays at home to look after his children is less of a man.
Wow.
And so there's it's not maybe a new conservatism. There is a trait amongst young men. Women have become much more, to coin a phrase, progressive and liberal, and men have sort of stayed in the same place. So it's the idea that women are much more willing to embrace the ideas of different styles of leadership, different styles of being valued, the huge changes we've seen in our industry with female leadership, whereas men have sort of stayed in what might be described as a rather more old-fashioned position, that women should be at home for some reason and they should be looking after children, and men who do that are somehow not to be respected. And I think a lot of that does come down to the Andrew Tate and Andrew Tate light phenomenon.
It's weird, this, because the younger generation isn't valuing the fact that they have fathers that they can connect with. If you think back to our grandparents' era, where a father would come back probably from war, not discuss what he'd been through, get straight into work and be the kind of dad that, came home to a home-cooked meal, put his briefcase down, maybe sat in the front room and smoked a pipe, probably believed that children should be seen or not heard. I don't think that would have had a necessarily positive effect on sons or daughters. I get that men are a bit stuck. They're like, what should we be? Should we be alpha? Should we be the protectors? Should we have that traditional role? Should we actually be a bit more in tune with our feelings? It's this constant battle I find in men's minds as to how they should project themselves. They face ridicule, don't they, if they show too much emotion? They face criticism if they don't show enough. I do sort of feel sorry for men. I mean, am I being too sympathetic?
No, maybe a bit. I think that men are, we're pretty resilient, and I think we have been advantaged for generations. I think right back at you for men. I think, come on, everybody. This is a situation, as I said at the beginning of the podcast, where, it is in the living memory of my grandparents. They're dead now, but, I knew them and they knew a different type of life. And within their memory, women were not allowed to vote on the same rights as men. The violence against women and girls is appalling and is still appalling. The economic value gap if you become a mother and a father is so different. So I think, okay, hold on. But I do get your point, Camilla. How do you think we should tackle the arguments around feminism has gone too far? Because if you're talking to your daughter, let's talk about our daughters. Because I don't want them to be in a position to think, oh, golly, am I here unfairly, in the way that men should think about, am I here unfairly? Are we too quickly turning the wheel back to saying, it's all unfair, we've now got to have pro-equality rules for men? It's this thing of, if you think about the race discussion, this debate about, there's racism now about white people and we've got to change all that. And so let's get rid of all that other stuff. And, I worry there's going to be the same debate on sort of men and women, that somehow women are supposed to kind of get back in your box. And I think that's outrageous.
I'm always a bit conflicted on the whole feminism issue, because I was very much brought up by a strong mother and father who were quite suspicious, I think, of Germaine Greer types and bra-burning women's libbers. They were huge admirers of figures like, as diverse as Margaret Thatcher and Princess Diana. They weren't people who would have looked at that kind of like left-wing ultra-feminist brigade with that much fondness. And I remember all of my teachers at school were women, and the atmosphere of my school, this is the contradiction at the heart of this, because my parents absolutely said to me and brought me up saying, whatever your brothers do, you can do the same. You just do what you want to do. There was never a question of, would I do the same as the boys? Would I go to university? Would I go off and pursue a career? There was no question. They sometimes said to me, subsequently my father and my stepmother, after my mother had died, you want to have 3 children, it's going to be tough. You're going to need a lot of support. You know, you're in this quite high-powered job, etc., etc. But I was always empowered in that way. But they looked on some of my teachers, I think they thought they were lefties with a degree of suspicion. And then when it came to kind of fighting the so-called trans wars, I found myself aligned with people like Julie Bindel and Germaine Greer and some of these characters that I wouldn't think I had much in common with. I've always believed in meritocracy, so I object to any kind of positive discrimination. Just give them the job on the basis of their abilities, because I think it actually sets back women's rights and equality generally if it looks as if people are doling out jobs to perform some bizarre DEI tick box exercise genuinely. So that disturbs me. As far as my daughters are concerned, and maybe this is just a mother and sons thing, I do have a tendency to worry a bit more about my son than I do my daughters, even though that feels a bit counterintuitive. And it may be just because, well, I'm a strong woman and I'm perhaps what would be described as an alpha woman. And I kind of think, girls, you've got this. I just sometimes worry about my son navigating life. I don't know why I think that. Is there a propensity for boys to go more off the rails? Is there a propensity perhaps for boys to be more easily led? And maybe that explains the Tate factor. I also, by the way, you know, this women are afraid of men. That's not a statistic that, I don't like that statistic. I love men. I've always loved men. I've got 2 older brothers. Most of my childhood was just surrounded by men and boys. I wasn't a girly girl. I kind of got more even though I went to an all-girls school. I know that sounds odd. I worry, I don't want my son growing up in a world where there is this hostility. We've discussed it on the Daily Tea before, notwithstanding the fact that violence against women and girls has risen by, I think, 37% in the last 5 years, which is horrifying. I don't want my son going around thinking that all women think he's a predator or that there's something scary about him. But equally, I want to educate him, this is how you treat women.
I think I worry about my daughter and my son equally. I think that we've touched on this and we'll come back to this in future podcasts. The world they live in now is so different and so driven by social media and video and their smartphones that I think there are equal risks for both of them. What I don't want my daughter to ever hear is that somehow to ever go, that phrase that has been used in the 90s and 2000s, she has it all. She has lots of things that she needs to push against and needs to be strong about. In the same way that my generation, it's really interesting listening to you about going into work. For my, female friends of my generation, I'm not that much older than you, but female friends of my generation, lots of them all learnt secretarial skills. They learnt how to touch type, and they went to schools where being an empowered professional was not really seen as what women did. I just keep going back. I'm in my 50s. I keep going back that it wasn't very long ago when women who are my age were put in certain lanes and expected to do certain types of jobs. My mother was in the civil service, and when she was working there in the 1960s, she was offered an opportunity to be posted abroad, but as a woman wasn't able to go with her spouse. A husband was allowed to take their spouse and children, but a woman didn't have the same rights. And that is not very long ago.
The other thing that worries me perhaps about the march of women in the workplace, which is a phenomenally brilliant thing, and I totally support it, but I do not want it to happen at the erosion of women's roles as mothers. I sound possibly a bit Trumpian right now, a little bit 1980s or 1950s, but this whole pursuit of a career, and then suddenly you get to 45 and you realise you might have missed your opportunity to have children. I often mentor a lot of women in the office, and one of the main questions they always ask younger women, maybe they've just settled down, is, maybe I should delay starting having children. And I always say, please don't. Just have the children and the work will fit around it. And I am quite traditional about family and the joy that family brings. We can go get, men and women, go and get the career, but the motherhood piece, I don't want motherhood to be denigrated in any way, as we all, as you say, look in search of having it all. There's no having it all. This is quite interesting and again a bit disturbing. Half of young women in the UK feel lonely, a new survey has revealed. This was done by the Belonging Barometer, and it suggested that 49% of women aged 18 to 24 report feeling lonely compared to 29% of the general population. And again, this is perhaps something to be said for sort of social media isolation, the fact that men and women, there is no such thing, apparently, Kamal, as the discotheque anymore. People aren't going clubbing, they aren't meeting each other enough. It's all about Netflix and staying home, which again is a little depressing.
Coming up, we speak to the polling expert at Ipsos who talks us through why some of these trends are happening. So, Kelly Beaver, the Chief Executive of Ipsos UK and Ireland, thanks so much for joining the Daily Tea. Kelly, run me through what you take from this research, which is not only UK, but is actually global, about the attitudes of the general public to what might be described as diversity, equality issues.
So you're right, Kamal, it is a global study. It's over 30 nations around the world, around 24,000 people that we have spoken to and sought to understand their views around gender equality predominantly. And what you can see in the data is that actually over the period of time we've been running this study, so it's roughly around 24,000 each year, between 2018 and 2025, we have seen a significant rise in the proportion of people who are stating things like women's equal rights in my country have gone far enough, for example. So whilst we still see in the data that people believe that reaching gender equality is important, there's a degree of backlash that is starting to come through in the data as well, and particularly for young men, Generation Z, young males, where they are more likely than their counterparts in other age categories, generational categories, and also more likely than young women to agree with statements such as men are expected to do too much to support gender equality, or it's been promoting women's equality, we're going so far that it's actually discriminating against men. And so those are some of the trends that are coming through in the data.
And Kelly, what do you put that down to?
So we don't necessarily have all the data and understanding to be able to compellingly tell you what's happening, but we do have our global trends work, which gives us an indication of some of the macro forces that could be at play that's shaping the public opinion that I've just described to you. One is around sort of three things for me, Kamal. One is around the perceived sort of scarcity of opportunity, and we do see this coming through in our data. People are telling us that they believe young women are more likely to have a better future than young men by comparison. And we also see in other data a high rise in anti-establishment feeling as well, that sort of divisive sentiment that's coming through alongside that sort of less optimistic outlook for young men in the future. The second thing I'd say around this is, if you think back to what's been happening over the first 2 decades of the 21st century, there has been a real amplification in this sort of push to support marginalized groups' progress. So everything from the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter movement, etc. And so it's risen up in public awareness as something where there is a drive to see improvement. So it's raised awareness of it, but also attention towards it. And the last thing that's coming through at a macro level that I think could be playing into this is a real rise of nostalgia and nostalgic sentiment. And we see this, it's not just a global thing here. This is really, if you look at the UK in particular, you can see this coming through. You can see it feeding into some of the rises of popular trends, like more recently, have you seen the trend around trad wife, for example, which is becoming a more popular concept even amongst young women themselves. But this, harking back to how things were better in the past, is a sentiment that we're seeing rise as well.
When you come to questioning women about this issue, do women think that equality, their rights, gender rights, have gone far enough?
So overall, no. The answer is no. The majority of women do not hold that opinion. But we do find that there's still around a third of women, and in particular young women, again Gen Z women, who do hold some of those similar opinions. Things like I think we've got 36% of Gen Z women who say that things have gone so far that we're now discriminating against men. So there is still still is a cohort of women who perceive that to be the case, yes. But the majority still believe there's work to be done.
Kelly, I know that you are about data and the polling, and that's the work that Ipsos does. How should people respond to this data? Or is that not somewhere, Kelly, that you want to step? That's not your role, is to tell us what's happening, not to tell us what to do about it. But I just wondered if you had any thoughts, as yourself a female leader of some significance, about how do we respond to this movement amongst young people, but maybe even more particularly across all demographics, that we've sort of gone too far in some way, or gone far enough on this equality journey?
Well, Kamal, I think as I said earlier, we've been doing this work now since 2018, tracking some of the sentiments. And it was a number of years ago where we started to see the flicker of disillusionment and even pushback from young men coming through. And at the beginning, it was a small signal, but it's becoming louder and louder. In the last year in Western Europe, it has subsided a little bit. And we're trying to see whether that's a long-going trend or whether that actually is just a blip in the data overall over a time series. But what I would say is the data is there. It's not just our study that's picking this up. It's across multiple different data sets and sources. And so, you need to identify that it is something that is real. And as a result of it being real, it does need to be considered in some of the actions taken forward. One of the things that we also test on is around whether policies are working. So the policies that are being put in place by employers and governments in the countries around the world to help improve gender equality. And we don't get any overriding perception from the public that they are really believing that those policies are the things that are making the difference. You've as many say they've made no difference as you do who say it's making a difference. So, policy is only one part of the solution. The other thing that comes through very clearly in a range of studies that have been done is the role of media in how narratives are formed and how framing of particular topics are being put into the public domain. And that really does matter. That media narrative does matter. And then lastly, just the acceptance that there is this issue now. It is arising. Young men are feeling more left behind. There is some work to be done to appreciate that and to think about how you bring men, women of all generations together on this journey for the greater good.
Kelly Beaver, I think the big point then, Camilla, that she leaves us with is this should be a nuanced conversation. It's not black and white. And we need to ensure that we are still supporting women and their progress, but not allowing resentment to grow because we are not having a sophisticated enough conversation about what equality looks like in the 21st century.